Yes, that story, it is about you. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lex, and thank you for spending some time with me today. So today, this video came about because I saw someone else's video and that made me think of a thing, and then I read something that made me think of a thing, and then those things mixed in my head, and I need to kind of say something about it. I know, that doesn't make sense. What I am thinking about is the veracity or the truth that we find in fiction. And let me tell you how I got to thinking about this. First is, very recently, I saw a video by Ollie over at CriminOlly, and it was a review of Stephen Graham Jones' new book, The Buffalo Hunter, which is a piece of historical fiction, or it's a horror novel that is a piece of historical fiction. And before his review, Ollie discusses this idea. He explains a little bit of his experience or his opinion of historical fiction. And his position was that there's something about historical fiction where it can be about something, it can be making a statement, it can be about a topic or an issue, and in the case of that novel, it is about the treatment of the Indigenous Americans by white folk, that due to being historical fiction as opposed to contemporary fiction, it can be about that issue without feeling preachy due to the distance that the audience has from the time period of the story being told. And I have thought and talked about a very similar thing in a recent video I did that was looking at James by Percival Everett and The Reformatory by Tanariva Due in conversation. And in that, I speculated that, now those are both pieces of historical fiction, but The Reformatory takes place in 1950, and James takes place about 100 years before that, during the antebellum South. And they're both more or less looking at the same thing, which is the treatment of black people in America. One of them, the treatment of black people during chattel slavery, one during the Jim Crow era. One of the things that I postulated is that, to some extent, even though it is historical fiction, the Reformatory isn't remembered history. And because of that, due to that kind of temporal distance, that readers, especially white readers, feel more complicity in the atrocities that take place in that book than they do in James, because the distance from it is less. And so there is something about the distance that the reader can place themselves from the story that allows them to experience it as more immediate or not. If a story is far enough in the past, then it isn't about you, necessarily, right? So that's an interesting thing to think about, how fiction talks about the past in certain ways that says something about the present. So that's the first thing that got me thinking about this. Now, the second thing is, I recently finished The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Guin, and after finishing it, I read the introduction, and she has a really wonderful introduction, and I wanted to read a little bit of that and share a little bit of that. This whole video might just be an excuse to share some of that introduction with you. So let me share that, and then I will try to connect those two and explain where my thinking has been going. This doesn't give anything away about the story. It has nothing to do with the novel at all. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, just a few selections from it. The whole thing is quite short, though, to be honest. Science fiction is often described, and even defined, as extrapolative. The science fiction writer is supposed to take a trend or phenomena of the here and now, purify it and intensify it for dramatic effect, and extend it into the future. If this goes on, this is what will happen. A prediction is made. Fortunately, though extrapolation is an element in science fiction, it isn't the name of the game by any means. It is far too rationalist and simplistic to satisfy the imaginative mind, whether the writers or the readers. Variables are the spice of life. This book is not extrapolative. If you like, you can read it, and a lot of other science fiction, as a thought experiment. Let's say, says Mary Shelley, that a young doctor creates a human being in his laboratory. Let's say, says Philip K. Dick, that the Allies lost the Second World War. Let's say this or that is such and so, and see what happens. In a story so conceived, the moral complexity proper to the modern novel need not be sacrificed, nor is there any built-in dead end. Thought and intuition can move freely within bounds set only by the terms of the experiment, which may be very large indeed. The purpose of a thought experiment, as the term was used by Schrödinger and other physicists, is not to predict the future. Indeed, Schrödinger's most famous thought experiment goes to show that the future, on the quantum level, cannot be predicted, but to describe reality, the present world. Science fiction is not predictive. It is descriptive. The Weather Bureau may tell you what next Tuesday will be like, and the Rand Corporation will tell you what the 21st century will be like. I don't recommend that you turn to writers of fiction for such information. It's none of their business. All they're trying to do is tell you what they're like and what you're like. What is going on, what the weather is now, today, this moment, the rain, the sunlight. Look, open your eyes, listen, listen. That is what the novelists say. But they don't tell you what you will see and hear. All they can tell you is what they have seen and heard in their time in this world. A third of it spent in sleep and dreaming, and another third of it spent telling lies. I talk about the gods, and I'm an atheist. But I'm an artist too, and therefore a liar. Distrust everything I say. I am telling the truth. The only truth I can understand or express is, logically defined, a lie. Psychologically defined, a symbol. Aesthetically defined, a metaphor. In reading a novel, any novel, we have to know perfectly well that the whole thing is nonsense, and then, while reading it, believe every word of it. Finally, when we're done with it, we may find, if it's a good novel, that we're a bit different from what we were before we read it, that we have changed a little, as if by having met a new face, crossed a street we never crossed before. But it's very hard to say just what we learned, how we were changed. The artist deals with what cannot be said in words. The artist, whose medium is fiction, does this in words. The novelist says in words what cannot be said in words. Words can be used thus paradoxically because they have, along with a semiotic usage, a symbolical or metaphorical usage. All fiction is metaphor. Science fiction is metaphor. What sets it apart from older forms of fiction seems to be its use of new metaphors, drawn from certain great dominants of our contemporary life. Science, all the sciences and technology and the relativistic and the historical outlook among them. Space travel is one of these metaphors. So is an alternative society, an alternative biology. The future is another. The future, in function, is a metaphor. A metaphor for what? If I could have said it non-metaphorically, I would not have written all these words, this novel, and my characters would never have sat down at my desk and used up my ink and typewriter ribbon in informing me and you, rather solemnly, that the truth is a matter of the imagination. So I think that is an incredible exploration of what it means to engage in art and literature, and how we find truth through metaphorical language, which is to say, language of untruths, right? And thinking of the discussion of historical fiction, I would also posit that the past is also metaphor. Now, specifically, I'm talking about the past in fiction, but also we can look at the past is metaphor insofar as there are certain political parties right now who are looking at an imagined past and saying that in order to become a successful society, we need to return to that past. That is also using past as metaphor, right? And weaponizing it. But let's stick to fiction for the moment, because sometimes reality is too depressing. The past is metaphor. The future is metaphor. By metaphor, I've often talked about one of the reasons I love reading so much is I think storytelling is how we understand ourselves, right? One of the uncommon traits of humans, what makes human history human, is our ability to make myths. Myth-making is what makes human history human. Myth-making, telling stories about ourselves, trying to understand ourselves in ways that isn't limited to our everyday experience. When I say myth-making, I don't just mean religious myth-making, also sociological myth-making. All identity groups are myth-making, right? Myth-making is storytelling. Storytelling is using metaphor. Metaphor is using language that is non-dialectical, that is not directly in relationship to everyday truths, so it can speak to something bigger, to a truth that is more important than the everyday, that is more important than the dialectic. So what am I getting at? What's the point? What the ideas I've been thinking about, and I'm always thinking about these ideas, this isn't new, but having Ollie talk about the utility of historical fiction and putting that in the context of Ursula K. Guin saying that all fiction is metaphor. What I'm thinking about is every time I read a book, what is that metaphor saying to me about me? And how can I engage in that metaphor in a meaningful way? How can I read any novel, any piece of fiction in such a way as learn something about myself using the untruths that book necessarily weaves? How can I discover myself in the myth-making that is found in fiction? How can fiction be more true than everyday life because it points at a truth that I can't understand without that metaphorical language? As she says, logically defined, it may be called a lie, but on an aesthetic level, it's called metaphor. Now, obviously, this is a dangerous road you can go down, right? Looking at how we weaponize ideas in order to harm others, right? It is a two-way street in that regard. Not all metaphor, not all myth-making is done for the betterment of society. So that's an important thing to think about too. But what I really appreciate thinking about is that when I'm reading something, and when you're reading something, it's an opportunity to engage in a relationship with a non-real thing that tells you something important about reality. That is what I love fiction for. That is why I appreciate reading so much. And that is what I hope everyone can get from their reading. Not necessarily in an explicit way, but when you are engaging in literature, whether it be, literary fiction or pulp fiction or anywhere on that scale, what you're getting from it is an opportunity to learn something new about yourself that maybe you already knew, but you didn't have the language to explain it, because that language isn't dialectical or straightforward. That language relies on metaphor. It relies on examining the past and the future in such a way as they can tell something about the present that only exists through the aesthetic, not through the literal. Anyway, I could go on and ramble ad nauseum about this because it excites me. But instead of doing that, I'm going to say I'd love to hear what you have to say about all this. The idea that all fiction is metaphor, or the idea that stories can be set in a past or a future that allows them to have some sort of message, and that message then is internalized in a way that doesn't feel like preaching because it has some temporal distance from our reality. What do you think about that? Do you think that's a valid statement, or do you think that's maybe, fudging the lines a little bit? I'd love to hear what fiction means to you and how you find truth in fiction. But for now, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.